Silence. A chilling silence that spread like venom through that cold Michigan home. As Officer Ben Horn stepped across the threshold, he knew something was terribly wrong. But he had no idea that beneath those low-hanging basement ceilings, a sinister mind had woven a trap of death.
Come on, wake up! Don't do this to me, please wake up! Help! Is anyone there? She's not breathing! Please help me!
Jimmy Allen hunched over his wife's body, screaming as he performed CPR. The crying, the trembling, it was all perfect, a masterpiece of a broken heart. But then, a miracle happened.
Wait! I have a pulse! She's still alive!
The paramedics were relieved, but Jimmy, the color drained from his face. In his eyes, there was no relief, only dread, a dark despair, as if the greatest piece of evidence in his twisted story had just come back to life to haunt him. Why was a husband so devastated to find out his wife had survived? Get ready, because today we are uncovering the dark secrets of that basement. This is the story of a killer who tried to script an accident, but made one living mistake. It was a warm September evening in Michigan, 2018. To the outside world, Jimmy and Amy Allen were the picture-perfect couple. They had been married for 15 years, raising a daughter and living a quiet life. But behind the closed doors of their home, a suffocating darkness was beginning to take hold. The day started normally. Breakfast together, smiles, and plans for the evening. Jimmy, a 37-year-old man who prided himself on structure and control, even left work early to take a nap. That evening, they dropped their daughter off at a high school football game and headed downtown for drinks. Everything seemed fine, until the topic of their future came up. Jimmy wanted to move back south, but Amy wasn't interested. As they sat at the bar, Amy began staring at her phone, dismissive and distant. A tense argument erupted. It was a cold, sharp disagreement that ended with Amy walking home alone in the dark while Jimmy drove back in their car. According to Jimmy, when Amy finally arrived home at 7:58 p.m., she headed straight for the basement. He claimed he went down to check on her a few minutes later, only to find her fretting over one of their 5 cats. They argued again, vicious insults were traded, and Jimmy eventually walked away, leaving his wife alone in the dim light of the basement with an extension cord. He claimed he spent the next 25 minutes upstairs, distracted by a Jim Carrey movie, completely unaware of what was happening beneath his feet. It wasn't until he went back down to squash the beef before picking up their daughter that he made the horrifying discovery. "I saw what looked like an upturned kitty litter pail," he told officers. He claimed he found Amy hanging, unresponsive, but as the police began to arrive, they noticed something that didn't fit the script of a grieving husband. The basement ceiling was barely 7 feet high. Amy was 5'6". To the seasoned eyes of the investigators, the math of a hanging in that tiny, cramped space simply didn't add up. They weren't looking at a tragedy, they were looking at a carefully constructed lie. The perfect husband was hiding a monster inside, and the accident in the basement was only the beginning of a much darker truth. Investigators were left with one burning question. If this wasn't a suicide, why would Jimmy Allen kill his wife? The answer began to surface only when Amy's family stepped forward, revealing a story that sent chills down the detectives' spines. To the world, Jimmy was a provider, but inside that house, he was a warden. The family revealed that Jimmy was a master of control, keeping Amy in a psychological cage for years. He didn't just manage the finances, he monitored every move the family made, from what they ate for dinner to what they posted on social media. Jimmy would frequently track Amy's exact location and sent her screenshots, demandingly asking, "Why are you there?" The isolation was absolute. Jimmy had even forbidden Amy from speaking to her own son, Caleb, and her parents. Amy was living in a state of constant surveillance. But in the suffocating darkness of her marriage, Amy had found a secret window to the outside world. Deep within Amy's phone, police discovered a trail of messages to a man named George. For 3 years, Amy and George had been in a secret affair, sharing hours of phone calls and video chats. Even on the day Amy died, she was messaging George. At 5:07 p.m., George texted, "I wish we could be together right now." At 5:29 p.m., Amy replied, "I'm excited to see you again." Incredibly, even as she sat right next to Jimmy at JR's bar that night, she was still texting George. The detectives developed a new theory. Perhaps Jimmy had caught a glimpse of her screen at the bar or during the drive home. For a man obsessed with total dominance, his wife's betrayal would have been an unforgivable act of rebellion. Yet, when detectives confronted Jimmy about the affair, he didn't flinch. "That's not possible," Jimmy said with a cold, dismissive smile. "My wife is too shy, too introverted. She doesn't even have the capacity to talk to other people like that." Jimmy was convinced he had broken Amy's spirit so completely that she would never dare to defy him. He had no idea that his quiet wife had built an entire world right under his nose. Now the police had a motive and a suspect, but they still had to prove exactly what happened in that basement. Jimmy Allen believed he had written the perfect murder script. The sobbing, the ripping of his shirt, and the theatrical rage over a bowl of potato chips. It was all a calculated performance for the police. But there's an old saying in the world of crime. A man can lie, but physics never does. Detectives returned to that cold basement. They looked at the extension cord and then at the low-hanging ceiling. Something didn't feel right. Amy was 5'6", and the basement ceiling was barely 7 feet high. Jimmy claimed Amy had used that space to end her life, but the laws of science were telling a much different story. Investigators reached out to a forensic engineering lab in Michigan to reconstruct the exact scene Jimmy described. They used a forensic dummy with the same weight and height as Amy. When they tried to replicate the hanging exactly as Jimmy had claimed, the results were startling. "It's impossible," the experts concluded. The extension cord was too long and the ceiling was too low. If Amy had dropped from that height, her feet would have hit the floor every single time. Without a high platform or a stool, a fatal hanging in that tight space was physically impossible. More importantly, the cord itself couldn't have sustained the tension. It would have slipped or snapped under the weight. But the real bombshell came when Amy's autopsy report was finalized. The report tore Jimmy's story to shreds. Amy's neck didn't have the typical V-shaped marks found in a hanging. Instead, the injuries pointed to manual strangulation. The internal muscles of her neck told a story of immense pressure, the kind of pressure that comes from someone's hands. Detective Larry Rothman then uncovered a dark piece of Jimmy's past. Amy's son, Caleb, came forward with a terrifying memory. He revealed that years ago, in a fit of rage, Jimmy had choked him too, squeezing so hard that Caleb felt his life slipping away. The picture was finally clear. That night at the bar, or perhaps on the way home, Jimmy must have discovered Amy's secret affair. The warden's obsession with control turned into a lethal fire. He trapped Amy in the basement and used his strength to silence her forever. Then he used the extension cord to stage a suicide to fool the world. Jimmy thought he was a genius, but he didn't realize that science and his wife's own body would become the ultimate witnesses against him. Jimmy's perfect story was about to fall apart. While the police were meticulously gathering evidence, Jimmy Allen made a move that shocked everyone. Just days after his wife's death, Jimmy packed up his entire life, his daughter Ashley, his 5 cats, and all their belongings, and fled Michigan to return to his hometown in Florida. Once there, the mask of the grieving husband began to slip. Within just 2 years, Jimmy hadn't just started a new life, he had already found a new fiancée. His dream of a perfect family was back on track, and their wedding was only 5 days away. He thought he had left the basement and the accident 1,000 miles behind him, but the long arm of the law was reaching out for him. In October 2020, Michigan authorities issued a warrant for open murder. Detective Rothman and his team were now certain Amy hadn't ended her life, it had been stolen from her. Florida police tracked Jimmy to his new home and arrested him just before he could walk down the aisle again. As he was booked into jail and the charges were read, Jimmy's cold, theatrical defiance returned. "How do you people sleep at night?" Jimmy asked the officers in a chillingly calm voice. His tone was still that of a victim, a man who believed he was being wrongfully persecuted. The real battle, however, was in the courtroom. When the trial began, prosecutors dropped one bombshell after another. Their star witness was none other than George, the man Amy had been seeing. George stood before the court and revealed everything Amy had told him about Jimmy, how he controlled her, monitored her, and kept her in a state of constant fear. The prosecution presented the forensic engineering experiment to the jury, proving beyond a doubt that a fatal hanging was physically impossible in that low-ceilinged basement. Jimmy's defense tried to paint Amy as a woman struggling with alcohol and depression, but the jury was looking at a man who had shown frustration the moment a paramedic announced his wife was still breathing. Jimmy believed his cleverness would save him. He thought that by running to Florida, he had outrun his sins. But he didn't realize that everyone in that courtroom could now see the monster hiding behind his carefully constructed mask. The courtroom was silent. This 3-year game of cat and mouse had finally reached its end. Jimmy Allen, the man who prided himself on being a Type A mastermind, stood in the dock, cornered by the very facts he thought he had buried. For 6 hours, the jury deliberated behind closed doors. They rewatched Jimmy's erratic body cam performances, analyzed the forensic impossibilities of the basement, and felt the weight of a wife whose final moments were spent gasping for air in a dark, suffocating cage. Guilty. When the word echoed through the room, there was no remorse on Jimmy's face. His mask remained as rigid and cold as ever. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. His dream of a perfect family in Florida with his new fiancée had shattered into 1,000 pieces. In October 2021, the judge delivered the final blow. Jimmy Allen was sentenced to 20 to 45 years in prison. The man who once controlled every move, every meal, and every message of his wife and children was now locked in a 6x8 cell, where every second of his own life was controlled by someone else. Today, Jimmy resides at the St. Louis Correctional Facility in Michigan. He won't even be eligible for parole until the year 2040. But perhaps the most chilling part of this entire story is that Amy fought for her life in that hospital for 3 days. She didn't give up. It's as if her pulse returned for one reason only, to tell the world that her husband was not a savior, but a killer. Amy Allen finally found justice, but Jimmy Allen's story remains a haunting lesson for those who believe they can bury their sins in a dark basement, because the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, always finds a way to beat again.